And if you have any videos, you can also share with us. But hello, everyone. Welcome to our live stream today. We are now currently live. My name is Mnar Adley. I'm the founder and director of MintPress News and your host today of the Mintcast podcast. Alan will be joining us again next week. So this show, as you all know, is made possible by supporters like you. So as we face shadow banning on many platforms and the crackdown on independent anti-war journalism intensifies, we ask that you support us by becoming a member on our Patreon page, which we will link in the comments below. However, for our next guest, the repression was just turned up a notch to an 11. While returning to his native Great Britain, investigative journalist Kit Klarenberg was arrested at the airport by 6 plainclothes counter-terrorism officers, interrogated, and kept isolated for hours. Kit is an investigative journalist who contributes to The Cradle, The Grey Zone, and right here at MintPress News. Kit, welcome to the show today.
Hey, how's it going?
Good. So first, I think it would be really helpful if you just laid out exactly what happened to you a few weeks ago when you tried to enter England via plane. Could you just tell us what happened?
Yeah, sure. So on the 17th of May, I flew into London's Luton Airport, and the second we touched down, the pilot said over the tannoy, everyone have your passports ready because the border control is just around the corner. Because I hadn't been back to the UK in some time, well over a year, a part of me wondered whether the airport had been restructured since I was last there. But no, as I descended onto the tarmac, it was clear there was a team of plainclothes officers intensively checking everyone's ID, everyone's passport as they got off. The second that the one officer saw my name, he said, "Right, come with me." I was then frog marched, flanked by this team of 6 officers to a back room. I was told that I was being detained under Schedule 3 of the 2019 Prevention of Terrorism Act. And then I had to hand over my digital devices, my bank cards, the passwords to my digital devices, my camera and phone memory cards. Again, I had to give the pins to my SIM cards, and I was subject to an intensive search. I had to take my shoes off. I was patted down, quite intrusively, and then I was grilled for 5 hours on everything and nothing, pretty much, by and large related to my journalism. But I think that they had a darker agenda.
So tell me a little bit more about the Terrorism Act that they held you on, and how was that used against you? What was their reasoning for that?
Sure. So the 2019. I might add that Britain has for a very long time had the most sweeping counter-terror laws in the Western world. Arguably even in the world. They overturn centuries-old and hard-fought for rights and protections and even freedoms that average citizens enjoy, and grant police sweeping and indeed often very disconcertingly and disturbingly vague powers. So typically when people are stopped under the 2019 Act, it's under Schedule 7, which refers to individual activity, which is potentially a threat to the state or potentially a threat to national security, which is, a disturbing proposition enough. But the Schedule 3 is even more Orwellian because it refers to alleged or suspected state threats. The obvious suggestion being that I and or my journalism posed a threat to the British state. Now, the wording of the law is such that someone can be or represent a state threat without intending to, or wanting to, or knowing they're doing it, and also without the state on whose behalf, the kind of foreign enemy state on whose behalf they are acting, knowing or wanting them to either. So it's quite some conspiracy, isn't it, when both conspirators don't actually know they're conspiring together, and don't have a pre-agreed objective or game plan in mind. But yeah, so it doesn't stop there. So in effect, one of the powers that's grants the police is the ability to, yes, as I say, ask or demand under threat of arrest the passcodes to your electronic devices, yes, and your PIN codes to your SIMs or your tablet, in my case, or your computer passwords. There was a French publisher who was arrested a few weeks prior to my arrival for refusing to hand over his the passcodes to his digital devices, and police have kept them, and there's no indication they'll ever give them back, quite worryingly. But in effect, it states in some of the paperwork that I was provided with by nameless officers. I only learned their passcodes. I didn't learn their names. I was prohibited from doing so. And it states, you are not under arrest and you are not suspected of having committed a crime. So, so good, so encouraging. But then the kicker is that this means that you are not being interviewed under caution. Therefore, you will be arrested if you refuse to answer questions. Now, Britain is the country that invented the right to silence, and in fact, until relatively recently, it was enforced so stringently as a legal principle that people couldn't testify in their own defence at criminal trials because it was felt improper, the prospect that someone's words could be, twisted or taken out of context or used against them. So, I mean, this is a huge regression, going back over centuries. And it is in keeping with the kind of totalitarian nightmares we are told occur in enemy countries like Russia and China and North Korea. But it seems rather every day in humdrum in quaint old Britain.
So it's obviously absolutely ludicrous and yet tragically predictable now in the West that you were, as an investigative journalist, arrested under the terrorism rubric. Can you comment on the use and misuse of that word in modern discourse and how governments the world over are exploiting it?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the very phrase, indeed, like concept of terrorism is like complete bullshit. And it is used by primarily Western countries to refer to violence directed at them, or at least like violence they don't like. I mean, my adopted home country is Serbia. The scars of the NATO terror campaign are very much still there. Bombed out buildings, people missing limbs, babies born with birth defects because Britain and America used depleted uranium, which they have, very eagerly and proudly sent to Ukraine recently. So yeah, it's a nonsensical term. It basically comes into currency and usage in the 70s at a time when the Israelis were attempting to frame the response from Palestinians to their brutal and criminal occupation, not as, yes, a provoked counter response, but as part of an ideology of violence. Violence for violence sake. They do it because they hate our freedoms. That sort of war on terror rhetoric. And so, yes, I mean, it can very easily be misapplied or abused for the purposes of criminalising perfectly legitimate legal dissent. Now, there was a phrase that the British police used for a very long time called domestic extremist, and they would slap this label on people wearing Palestine solidarity badges. Grandmothers who opposed fracking were all domestic extremists. They were forced to admit that they didn't have a legal working definition of the term, due to a judicial review that was leveled against the government. That they admitted it was a completely meaningless term that meant whatever they wanted it to. And I think that you kind of see this with the term terrorism as well, is that the UN has a wide variety of different definitions of terrorism and can't agree on one, because if they do agree on a definition such as, oh well, it is violence for political reasons, well then Britain and America are the world's leading terrorists, and we can't have that, can we? So yeah, I mean, and I've made this point before, but I think it bears repeating, that vague language contained within the 2019 Act, where you can be serving hostile state interests without knowing it or intending it, but this is still potentially a criminal offence. This is really terrifying, and this is going beyond the realm of people being deplatformed or censored or shadow banned on social media because they express the wrong opinion or they post information that the powers that be don't like. This is people getting detained, arrested, investigated, and potentially even jailed because they are spreading quote unquote Russian disinformation by challenging mainstream narratives on any issue. I have reported on and have reviewed personally British government documents on disinformation, which number one admit that one of the key barriers to countering it is that it's often factually true, but number two also cite examples of disinformation, such as the perspective that the Iraq war was legal. This is really frightening, and this is not a looming threat. We are living in it now. There's an individual called Graham Phillips who. He was a rather controversial YouTuber who travelled many times to Donetsk and Luhansk, embedded with the kind of separatist rebels there over the years. Now, he travelled to Ukraine after the Russian invasion last year, and he conducted a number of interviews with Ukrainian prisoners of war. I might add that I think he did the wrong thing. This is not something I would ever even think to do. But the British government responded by seizing his assets, his home, closing his bank account, and they did so despite documents indicate, knowing they had no legal basis for doing this, that this was a criminal act and that they were engaging in unilaterally. They were advised not to do it by their own lawyers. So, I mean, the idea that the fact that they completely got away with that, I think bar Peter Hitchens, there was zero critical comment on it in the media. They are emboldened. They know that they can do whatever they want and strike at whoever they want.
And let's talk a little bit about the coverage that you've done that you believe has made you a target. I mean, you've been at the forefront of covering, like you said, the UK national security state. And the war in Ukraine, and how Western governments and NATO allied governments are basically pouring fuel on the fire there in the US proxy war against Russia inside of Ukraine. So tell me more about some of the coverage that you have done that you believe has made you a target.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, one interesting thing that I only recently found out is Britain has an organisation called the Defence and Security Media Advisory Committee. This is a Ministry of Defence and British Security and Intelligence Service run body, which regularly meets with the heads of the BBC and the Guardian and other major mainstream outlets, and they determine how particular stories related to national security, which is in itself a very vague, sweeping concept, what stories related to national security can be reported on and how they can be reported on. And it creates a situation in which the overwhelming majority of news that the British citizens read in the British media is edited, censored, and maybe even written by Britain's national security establishment. Now, in the minutes of their most recent meeting, in which its representatives discussed the past 6 months, so this is kind of from October, November last year up until April, May this year, one of the military people on this committee said that this period saw the most controversial stories that they had ever seen and the most sensitive material enter the public domain in the time that they've been part of this. Now, this was a period when Grey Zone, and I led the charge on this, was on a regular basis exposing the reality of Britain's contribution to the Ukraine proxy war. This included plotting to blow up Kerch Bridge, constructing a partisan terror army to carry out sabotage and other, kind of terror strikes in Russian and indeed Russian occupied territory. These are things that the British government want kept under wraps. They are rigidly and determinedly sticking and trying to maintain the narrative that Ukraine is a this kind of innocent virgin liberal democracy which Russia has invaded because Putin is a kind of Machiavellian Bond villain who enjoys the smell and the taste of blood. The reality is that Britain has for over a decade been trying to provoke what is happening now. Ever since the war formally started, they have been pushing the US to escalate ever further, ramp up tensions, boots on the ground, because they think that they're going to destroy Russia and it's going to be broken up into pieces, which they can exploit. That's not going to happen, but they are so determined to keep this reality secret that anything challenging the established narrative is seen as criminal. Now, yes, the Grey Zone has received a large number of leaks from anonymous sources. We have not always published the material. We have thought very carefully about whether this material is in the public interest. We have tried to authenticate it to 100% accuracy, and we've done what all journalists should do. And the fact that in a terror police interview, I'm being asked, does the grey zone have a formal agreement with the FSB, Russia's federal security service, to publish hacked documents? I mean, I had to suppress a laugh when I was asked that, but it's not funny. It's deeply disturbing. And I think there's an awful lot of projection in there as well, because Britain, like America, is heavily involved in funding, fake citizen journalist collectives and media outlets in kind of countries.
That's a very good point. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, it's a very common, and I think, yes, like kind of Britain actually takes a lead role in this. They certainly did in Syria. When a country is earmarked for regime change, whether through direct boots on the ground intervention or clandestine cloak and dagger coups, the British will usually set up a network of media outlets that extol anti-government messages, and of course the US has the National Endowment for Democracy, which has been doing the same thing with NGOs and charities since the early 80s. But yes, I mean, I do wonder whether their experience of doing these things means that they see all alternative media, i.e. the opposition from their perspective, that is challenging their narratives, as being secretly state-run. We see this in emails sent to and from Paul Mason, where he was talking about how he wanted to expose the grey zone and discover what our deliverables were to the Chinese and Russian governments, which is just completely insane. He was doing this in conjunction with an individual called Amal Khan. I have, of course, written a number of investigations for MintPress covering his shady background, but he was one of the individuals responsible for creating fake citizen journalist collectives for British intelligence in Syria and other parts of West Asia. Now, of course, when you live in that wilderness of mirrors for so long, everything looks like an op to you. Of course it does. So there's an enormous amount of projection.
Right, and that doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the actual journalists who we see as the faces of CNN or MSNBC or Fox News, who work literally directly with intelligence agencies, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite remarkable. I mean, CNN, CIA, and as I've heard many people call it. I mean, they have so many former, NSA, CIA, and Pentagon officials who are just their, kind of regular pundits now. I mean, it's beyond a joke. But yes, I mean, journalists are very, very easily co-opted. They're quite clearly groomed. I think that it would be almost impossible for someone who's not compromised in some way by the CIA and or MI6 to get a prominent job in journalism. We see this with Mariana Spring, who is the BBC specialist disinformation correspondent. She got that role pretty much fresh out of Oxford University, where she was in the same house as Richard Dearlove, the disgraced MI6 chief. And yeah, she got this job in March 2020, which is right when the British government wanted to crack down on any and all opposing viewpoints that ran contrary to their pandemic policies, like whether that was lockdowns or mask and vaccine mandates and the like. And yes, her sole targets are independent alternative media and journalists. They don't go after. She doesn't go after the BBC or any of the other well-established conduits for intelligence agency propaganda, which pump out lies on a daily basis. It's quite remarkable. And so yes, I mean, we see this with Bellingcat as well, which is axiomatically.
I was just thinking about Bellingcat. I mean, that's like the prime example of the national security state partnership with a journalism outlet, a so-called journalism outlet.
Yeah, and it's just like I think that I mean, it's quite remarkable the gymnastics that the media engages in to whitewash the reality of Bellingcat. Like the Times a couple of years ago, the Times of London, they published a fawning review of Elliot Higgins' awful book on how brilliant Bellingcat is by saying that, you know, Bellingcat very wisely refuses money from governments. You know, their biggest funder by far is the aforementioned National Endowment for Democracy.
The Ned, yeah.
The founders of which openly admit that they do overtly what the CIA did covertly and are engaged in all sorts of destabilization, regime change jobs, particularly targeting China now. I had an article go out a few hours ago via MintPress on their likely sponsorship of an organization called Safeguard Defenders, which has been behind an anti-Chinese psyop that there are these secret police stations operating all over the world on behalf of the Communist Party, which is, you know, just completely ludicrous rubbish. But, you know, people's lives are being ruined as a result. But yes, Bellingcat, they have, as the mighty Alan MacLeod has documented at length, they have a coterie of former spies amongst their contributors. They are heavily funded by the NED. They receive vast sums from the Foreign Office. They do work for intelligence cutouts like Adam Smith International and refuse to disclose what they did for these organizations. The idea that they're in any way independent and that their platform has been taken, not, you know, specifically granted, you know, from a position of protection is completely ludicrous.
Well, and Kit, what's so interesting about your case, you know, being interrogated and held by the British police is that it really didn't get any attention or support from these so-called human rights organizations that would normally defend journalists in like in African countries, for example, or in Middle Eastern countries that would call foul that they're being detained and interrogated and so forth. So you did receive one statement of support from the NUJ, which is the National Union of Journalists based in the UK, I believe. But they actually took down their statement of support. Can you tell me what the reaction has been overall from these, journalism support networks?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, to their part, at least partial credit, RSF, Reporters Without Borders, were in touch with me, you know, very, very quickly, and they took down a detailed report on what happened, and they said that they were looking at a number of similar cases, which was encouraging. And then a few hours later, the NUJ, as you mentioned, issued a rather brief, but still quite substantive statement expressing "quote unquote" great concern at my detention and asking for answers on why this happened. And then within 24 hours, it was removed from the internet without explanation. And, you know, like, there was all sorts of this threw up all sorts of anomalies, like the public head of the NUJ tweeted this out, and it was still left on her tweet timeline, the statement, which no longer existed. But yes, I mean, I'm not surprised. The NUJ is a pretty toothless organization. They have previously thrown Craig Murray and Julian Assange under the bus. And I think that there was an enormous amount of online pressure from the large number of people I've pissed off over the years. I mean, you can't do actual journalism without making a lot of enemies. And yes, that there was a concerted push to frame the narrative that I'm not a journalist, and therefore this was okay, or therefore I'm a spy, or I'm a hostile state actor. I mean, bearing in mind that the police specifically asked me, whether I had journalistic materials with me. They quizzed me at length about my professional affiliations and qualifications. They asked me, what protections would a press card give you, and all this other stuff, which they could find out via Google. I wonder whether they were trying to determine how much trouble they were in to stop me, or indeed, yes, whether they could successfully perpetuate the narrative that I'm not a journalist. I mean, that's an enduring smear against Julian Assange, which has been used to justify his incarceration. And yes, it now seems rather depressingly likely that he will be extradited to the US to stand trial and get sent to a supermax prison for 175 years. This notion that he's not a journalist when he has won multiple coveted journalism awards. He is a member of the Australian Union of Journalists. So yeah, I mean, that's quite frightening, but I am very heartened by how many people, including journalists and researchers and even pundits with whom I couldn't disagree more, have had cross words with in the past, who have condemned this very publicly. And said, completely unambiguously, this was completely wrong and should not have happened. And the British police have serious questions to answer about why I was harassed and detained in this manner. And yes, I am, I do take pride would be the wrong word, but I take some assurance and encouragement from the fact that literally tens of thousands of people all over the world, condemned this publicly, and a great many people reached out to me privately and publicly. When you're in a situation like this, you find out who your friends are, and I actually have a lot more than I thought I did.
And that's usually what happens when you go through a crisis. You find out who your real enemies are and who your true friends are. And unfortunately, this whole case against you has many worrying parallels to how British authorities have treated Wikileaks co-founder Julian Assange. But I hope that you remain a free man, and you're always safe and are able to continue the very important journalism that you are doing, much for MintPress, for the Gray Zone, and the Cradle. That is all for today, Kit. I really appreciate your time today. We're keeping it short today, but we're going to be having you back on in a couple of weeks to talk more about your journalism. Okay? Thank you so much.
Okay, absolutely. God bless you, Mnar. Take care.
Thank you.